even the assumption that volume will get you what you want is really starting to be, I'll say, like maybe not undermine, but that the rise of generative AI for producing content, it's starting to eat away at the idea that even if it's not perfectly efficient, if you crank that knob hard enough, you'll be in front of everybody.
Yeah. Welcome to the Lessons for Tomorrow podcast. Think of the show as the motivational poster in your ear. Each episode features lively conversations with technology and marketing leaders about what's changing now and what's coming next. We'll unpack what's working, what leaders are rethinking, and how they're planning for the future. Every guest brings a different story, a different perspective, and a different approach. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this episode with others. Let's jump into the episode.
Hi, everyone. My name is Peter Gavrilos. I'm one of the partner directors here at AmericanEagle.com. I'm going to be your guest host for today's podcast. Today, I have a special guest, Senior Director of Content Systems at Contentful, Jeff Eaton. Jeff, I'm not sure if you want to give a little intro about yourself, and then we can kind of jump into today's topic.
The safest thing to say is I'm a huge content publishing and content delivery nerd. I've been working in the space. I like to joke that I got involved right around the time Netscape got tables, and we were all very excited about it. But I've been working with small scale to large scale organizations that need the infrastructure for building communications, publishing, and that means content management. Even if people don't think about it, it's got to be there.
So in short, you're the content guru, is what you're saying.
At the very least,
okay.
A huge nerd.
Perfect, which is great considering today's topic. Today, Jeff and I will be talking about scaling content for a multi-channel world. So I think, Jeff, I don't know, maybe if you want to just give a very quick overview as to where you see content playing, an important part in today's world. It's everywhere. I think, there's a saying, content is king. So let's start with where you're seeing it most prevalent in the ecosystem, and kind of what changes you've seen happen to content over, let's say, the past 5 years. How is it different? How is it changing? How is it evolving?
So I tended to take a fairly expansive view of like, what is content? What is this stuff? Like, on the one side, you've got, content is the PDFs that we, people download. And on the other side, I think of it as basically, it is a function of organizations or even individuals needing to communicate. If a company or even a nonprofit or an individual artist or a government needs to communicate some sort of message to their partners or the public or whatever, content is how that happens. Even if you don't think of it as we're spinning up our content operations, you are planning and producing and distributing that stuff. And once that ball starts rolling, the work of figuring out how you're going to do it efficiently, how you're going to make good choices about where you spend your time and energy, those are all very important. And, the technology evolves and changes over time, but like that thread, I think, has always run through it. Yeah. And a lot has changed. I think probably the biggest shift in the past 5 years is that, like, I really seriously got involved in it like late 90s, early aughts, where everyone was just starting to say, maybe we should use a CMS. And there's a lot of different sort of cycles of change since then. But I think one of the biggest shifts is that we went through a period of time where there was significant siloing between different parts of businesses, like business operations, internal employee-facing communications and knowledge management, customer support, marketing of products, education and training. And then, some organizations, content is actually the content. Content is actually the product that they sell. So there's, other aspects of that too. But I think for quite a while, there were there was an acceptance that there would be different systems and different tools to account for the different kinds of needs that those different parts of an organization had. And one of the consequences of that was that marketing teams had a particular way of operating and particular kinds of content that they were very used to producing in certain ways that might not have been, the same way that like the technical support team produced knowledge base articles. And increasingly, as organizations, both as an efficiency and cost saving measure, wanted to start consolidating those things, the desire to move them onto shared systems or choose a platform that, they can treat as a single thing that we manage, that became a really big drive. In addition, though, I think increasingly organizations are realizing that marketing doesn't exist in a silo. The product spec sheets that you think of as living in the technical side of the organization, or the support forums where people come with questions, in the big picture of trying to convince people that your product is good or helping them succeed with it, that the marketing materials you produce rely on those things just as much. And a potential customer who's coming in to evaluate your company or evaluate your products, they're not thinking, oh, well, where's the marketing materials? I'll use that. They're taking in all the stuff that you produced and managing the consistency of those things and making sure that they're all sending the same message, that they're all up to date, that there's good coordination between the teams that are putting those things out on those different tracks. The need for that work, I think, has really driven a lot of painful transformation processes and a lot of hard work on figuring out how to best do those things, particularly over the last 5 years, I think.
Yeah. So it sounds like, you just gave us a ton of great information, but one of the main things I'm taking away from this is previously content was siloed. Marketing was in its own bucket, technical was in its own bucket, etc. What we're seeing now is kind of a migration towards like a single source of truth, where you're collecting all of that content, kind of keeping it together, making sure that it is, consistent across the board in terms of terminology, in terms of wording, in terms of messaging, and that the end user is now trying to ingest all of that instead of just one component at a time.
Exactly.
Okay. Awesome.
Yep.
Yeah. Talking about content in terms of, compiling it all in a centralized location. I think the other thing that we're seeing more and more is that content now is being shared via multiple channels. Mm-hmm. We have this single source of truth, but how is it being, given out to the end user? We mentioned a CMS, a great kind of core platform to have. But now content is being ingested via multiple sources. We have online applications, we have mobile applications, we have portals that data is stored in. What are you seeing in terms of the distribution of content nowadays to some of these other sources that are not just the CMS?
So I think there's two sides of that, actually. One is like the classic multi-channel issue of, it's easy to publish for the web, or it's easy to build an app that pushes stuff out there, or to set up a mailing list. But having all of those things running on the same playbook, pushing out consistent content, sometimes needing to differ, but still needing to use the same materials and operate together, coherently. That's a driver for a lot of complexity in most organizations.
No, I'm sure it's a challenge too, like a huge one that is coming out of this.
And this goes back, quite a few years, a little over 20 years ago. I think NPR was one of the first real innovators in the space. I think, folks in the content strategy or content, operations world have probably heard of COPE, create once, publish everywhere. Mm-hmm. That was the system that they built because they had a large central organization that was producing tons of material in multiple different, media formats, and a huge network of different local channels, their affiliates, that needed to use that content. In the olden days, it was, they got the recordings and they broadcast them. But with the rise of the web and the arrival of mobile apps and, news feeds, all of those different organizations needed to be able to take a core pool of NPR produced content and rebrand it, white label it, use it, in all the channels. So a lot of the earliest thinking about how you really tackle that in sort of the modern digital space, a lot of it grows out of the sort of pioneering work that they did to figure out how do you tackle this, and things like how do you approach separating the details of the presentation and design from the meat of this thing that we want to syndicate? They sort of they crawled through the rose bushes so we could walk. That's a terrible metaphor, but
they paved a way almost.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in today's day and age, though, how are you seeing brands carry that consistency through their various channels? How are they managing that? Because it seems like it's a huge undertaking.
A terrifyingly huge number of Google Docs.
Yeah.
I think realistically, that's the challenge. Even for organizations that are really primarily web and think of other distribution channels as sort of ways of augmenting, or steering more traffic to their web presence, even in that scenario, it's inescapable. And even inside of the organization, even before you start thinking about multiple channels, this idea that in our org, on our digital, in the digital presence that we have, when we produce something, we want to get the most value out of the time and the money and the resources that we've invested in creating it. And that means we probably want to use it in multiple different places or in multiple different ways. Just from a, meat and potatoes, how does the website get built perspective, if you write up a landing page for an upcoming event that you're using to, reach out to customers, well, you want all of the places where that event is being promoted or being referenced to use that same underlying pool of stuff that you produced, rather than producing 19 different pages or flyers or PDFs or whatever.
That's also a ton of additional work.
Exactly. And, it's a lot of work, and the consistency problem becomes significant. Keeping it in sync and keeping it consistent over time is also another sort of ongoing tax. So that idea of needing to plan out, what are we making? What are we doing? What are we trying to get out to people? What's the heart of it? How do we build what's going to make that most effective and make the most of it once we do, in all the places where we want to go? It's deceptively simple to describe it as in that way, but the complexity is for organizations that haven't built an infrastructure that works that way, that's mostly focused on final artifacts and the work to produce them. It's a huge lift, not just technically, but also in thinking about how they approach promoting an event or driving interest in a launch.
Well, I think also you have to be consistent and have that same tone, not only for your brand, but also if I'm an end user looking at something and, you want to avoid confusion.
Yeah.
Because you want the messaging to look almost identical or very, very similar. Because if I see two different tones, I'm going to be like, wait, I don't know.
Is this the right thing?
Yes. Is this the right thing? It inspires ambiguity and people get confused.
Yeah.
So.
And, on a bunch of different levels, from voice and tone in, what you're doing, to the design assets that you use to present and display things, to even how your website works versus how your app works. That need for consistency and coherence is, I think, probably one of the biggest challenges. And as the need to make the experience of getting that information more tailored to individual users, like with personalization and stuff that.
That's another topic. I think that could be its own podcast. Just
we'll put it in that, but
yeah, very interesting.
But yeah, I mean, I think that pressure combined with the overall environment of you need to make more, you need to get it in front of more eyes.
That was going to be, the next question I have for you is surrounding scaling. Because it seems like, okay, everyone needs relevant content. You need to push it to the right audiences. But now I think a lot of brands are facing this issue where it's like, how do we produce more? Not only do we need it to be consistent and, deliver the appropriate end result, but we also need more of it. Because it seems like, in this day-to-day world, we're inundated by content. So it seems like you want to just push out more to be more relevant. So, how are people dealing with that? Or in your personal experience, what are you seeing?
I think there's a couple of different ways that organizations are responding to that pressure. One is the sort of, just crank the knob to 11, make more, put more out there, find more channels, make a video tutorial series, whatever you need to stay in front of people.
Sure.
Just do it. I think the problem is the content ecosystem that everybody exists in is growing at such a dramatic pace that
it's rapid.
Yeah.
The amount of content I'm like inundated with every single day. I think there is also, and I think this is what you're about to say next, you want to push out a ton of volume, but you need to find some way in some niche to be impactful as well in your content delivery.
Yeah. And even the assumption that volume will get you what you want is really starting to be, I'll say, like maybe not undermine, but that the rise of generative AI for producing content, it's starting to eat away at the idea that even if it's not perfectly efficient, if you crank that knob hard enough, you'll be in front of everybody.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's a harder question.
I'm sure you'll catch something with just the volume play.
Exactly.
Absolutely. But then it also introduces like the idea of like content fatigue too.
Yes.
To a ton of end users. Like what is the right amount? Because you don't want to overwhelm an end user, but you want to make sure that you stay relevant.
And I think one of the themes that I try to emphasize when, today I work, with Contentful, I'm inside the house, the, CMS vendor, but I've also spent a lot of time as a consultant with large enterprise organizations. So I've sort of been on both sides of the fence, and probably the most important advice that I try to leave any of them with is knowing what your message is, what you're trying to communicate, and what outcome you expect of it.
Yeah.
What would stop happening in the world if we ceased publishing blog posts? What do we think would change? That's like what it's doing out there. And keeping that in mind, like what are the different purposes or intentions that we have?
It's almost you have to think backwards. What is the end goal first?
Exactly.
And then you can kind of plan backwards from there.
And I think that idea of pursuing intentionality is getting more and more important, and is only going to get more important for organizations that are, just dialing the knob harder and, making more doesn't make sense. So what's the play?
Right.
I think more clarity on why and for who and what do we expect to occur because of that helps shape the decisions that go into it in a way that if you are producing more volume, it's more effective. Mm-hmm. And if you are saying, well, let's be more circumspect in how much we put out there, let's focus on what's really paying off, figuring those things out helps you choose the things that are actually delivering.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like you have to find a sweet spot in between the two a lot of the time. Another question I have, and I think we experience it here at AmericanEagle.com because we put out a ton of marketing, a ton of information and content ourselves. But what are you seeing in terms of like bottlenecks in the current process when pushing out content? We already talked about, there's volume. We need to get out there. Let's also kind of tailor the messaging to make sure that it's impactful. But, in between the two, you also have to figure out how you're going to execute on all of this,
sort of a rule of thumb I tend to use is that like there's an inherent tax to any handoff or any coordination that needs to occur between multiple people or multiple teams. And the larger an organization gets, I think that's where, the problem gets felt more and more.
Yes, absolutely.
The more alignment you need to get, the more you need to make sure that the timing on message X isn't going to collide with something that's coming out over here. That production and validation process, I think, is where a tremendous amount of friction exists in a lot of organizations, and that's difficult. There's also just pure tool issues. A lot of the this is a consequence of that sort of consolidation that we talked about a little earlier. The ways that a customer support team has of creating, publishing, and maintaining information about how to log in and reset your password, or how to, get a replacement battery for your product, or whatever messages they need to capture and get out there. That process looks very different than a marketing organization that's planning a new campaign, and who needs to be in the loop, what different kinds of teams need to have their sort of moment to dive in and get their part of the work done. That's very difficult. And I think in the marketing world in particular, this idea of there's, the messaging oriented production team that plans the campaign and, writes copy and executes it. There's the design team that comes in and, figures out what's our vision for how this is going to look. There's usually a technical implementation team, development or IT that does that. And the handoffs between those teams are traditionally very, very friction filled. It takes a really, really solid operation to keep that smooth.
It's almost like you need to, like you said, as an organization gets bigger, it is so key and it's such a priority to define ownership of content in terms of creation. Like who is actually putting out the messaging? Because, we know firsthand working at AmericanEagle.com, we're designing websites. A lot of these CMS DXP platforms that we work with, they put themselves out there as very marketing friendly, which is great. Having easy access where you don't need a developer per se immediately to change content on a website, that makes life easier. But in ways, it could also make life difficult, because who actually has access? Who can make the changes? Is it aligned with the brand guidelines of the end company? So it's almost like you need to put in checks and balances somewhere as well. Like maybe, I don't know, gate off some access, or truly define who is owning what right off the bat in order for it to be successful.
And, that's actually something that, Contentful as an organization, we've learned, we've learned the hard way in working with large customers, as Contentful has grown from originally, a headless CMS, content API you could use to store your stuff into the larger world of like content orchestration, workflow, publishing, the process of that stuff. And now with, the last sort of generation or two of publishing tools that we've put out there, even the design aspect of it. I think Studio is the tool that we've got out there, and there's a whole swath of new stuff that we're working on right now that's going to be coming out soon that is really concerned with that stuff. And what we've found in working with teams that use tools like that is that the figuring out what we need it to do part is orders of magnitude harder than making it do that.
Sure.
Figuring out, okay, who's going to be in charge of what? We've got a design system. Who's allowed to push the edges of it and do something that isn't what we decided was on brand, but it's useful and, maybe it's a useful experiment on the edges. Who's allowed to do that? Who's the person that can sign off on it? Does the tool you have even make it possible to do that? Or are you explicitly locked into the, sort of the constraints of the design system? All those are really important things to navigate. And, I think it's easy to promise that a tool will simply solve that for you, whether that's at, Adobe scale or
that's almost like an overpromise,
Yeah, it's like there's hard decisions about how you need to work that are a part of that. And the tool's job is to make it as easy as possible to get there and to, stay out of your way as much as possible and to help improve those friction points where like the handoffs between different kinds of teams doing different kind of work,
Yeah.
it can be very easy for that to burn time
Sure.
in frustrating ways. Making those things easier is very different than saying to a marketer, for example, congratulations, now you too can be the designer.
Yeah.
It's like, well, maybe, but like also, I didn't say I wanted to, take on the work of doing the graphic design for a project.
So I think honestly, this is a great transition. We're talking about tooling, we're talking about timing, we're talking about communication between teams. Jeff, it would not be a podcast unless I brought up the most important topic right now, which is AI.
Of course.
So AI obviously is going to have some sort of impact on content creation, on content strategy. What do you think, is going to happen moving forward? Are people going to utilize this and it is really going to help them moving forward? Is it going to hinder them in some aspects? Is AI going to be something that we rely on heavily in terms of content moving forward from this time on?
Yes, all of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah,
okay.
I think to a certain extent, regardless of your feelings about AI, about, quality, safety, efficiency, whatever, to a certain extent, the cat's out of the bag. And a lot of organizations have already built a lot of their assumptions about how much they want to produce or how much, teams are expected to deliver with the assumption that some of that production work can be eliminated or carved off or dramatically shrunk at the very least using generative AI tools.
I think, and we talked about this earlier, that I don't think it's a true solve, but I'm sure it could assist with, the issue of, time to market in terms of this content, how fast you could push it out, the volume in which you could create it. So I mean, I think it could be everything's a double-edged sword,
Most of the organizations that I've talked to for my entire career, copywriting is not the time sink in producing, say, multi-channel marketing campaign.
Sure.
It's certainly part of it. And the cycle time on making new design assets or concepts, that time goes into that, work goes into that. But even if you were to reduce all of that to literally zero time consumption, a lot of the overhead is still in coordinating, in stitching the pieces together, in making sure that there's message consistency. And, and I think that's why when you see small, very nimble organizations moving very quickly on, either campaigns or delivering new approaches to things or, leveraging generative AI to produce stuff, one of the advantages they have inherently is there is just not as much that they are attempting to do.
Sure.
And, you can steer a speedboat faster than, a container ship. And generative AI, if you have the luxury of saying, we need to tweak our messaging, let's regenerate the website. Well, yeah, there's a lot of problems you don't have to worry about. But if you're, say, 10 years in and you've got a sort of deep back catalog of product information, past campaigns, PDFs, customer support materials, thought leadership work, all of that
It's
stuff.
Tons to sort through.
Yeah, it's like even saying, let's point AI at it and just tell it to update everything, that is not an automatic thing that's going to happen. You'll spend as much time building a reasonable framework for tackling it in a way that doesn't, blow everything up. You spend as much time doing that as you would a lot of the other manual parts of it.
Yeah.
And I think that has really shaped a lot of my thinking about what's changing. Previously, building the systems, like, hey, what are the core intentions we have for our content? Who are our core audiences? What are the different touch points that we have? What are the kinds of content we produce, and where do we see them fitting in that sort of matrix of outcomes we're trying to get to and audiences, stuff like that? How do our different channels work together? for a long time, you had to be very big indeed to justify spending the work of figuring that stuff out and planning a system for it all. Because, like at IBM's scale or something like that, well, yeah, you've got to keep the 97 different teams coordinated. So you need a system. Once you sort of move down the food chain to smaller organizations or younger ones, it was harder to justify, and it was easier to say, well, we'll just, we'll figure it out as we go, or maybe we'll just, unpublish the old stuff, or we'll deal with it. I think the speed of AI handling that pure production step has also revealed the importance of that planning, because you can't just tell, generative AI, go make me a campaign.
Yeah.
You need the structure.
Well, and I think it's not even just the planning. I think there's a huge step that comes afterwards as well, which is the review. I think
validating it.
Exactly.
How are we going to do it? What are we going to do? What do we believe is a good output from this thing?
Regardless of how AI is implemented, whether it's, pertaining to this conversation surrounding content or any other space in the digital world, there, in my opinion at least, should always be some human interaction or human review at the end to make sure that it is the content that you're looking for, because you wouldn't even believe, just in emails alone, I can absolutely tell if it was pumped out via AI. Sometimes it makes absolutely no sense. You could tell no one has reviewed it. I'll leave it at that, because I've just seen some very inconsistent messaging that you could tell no one has checked before it has gone through the door.
Yeah. And I think just at a purely technical level, I think the way that we tend to approach it is, AI is, generative AI is genuinely fantastic at smoothing over the rough edges in language, at translating between different kinds of ways of saying similar things, at expanding a particular thing into, more depth and detail if you give it the right, background information. Those are all great things, but the sort of framework for how do we know what we're actually trying to say? How do we determine if it's doing well? Those are things that you absolutely needed in place for AI to be effective. And happily, having those things in place also makes the human work go a lot smoother as well.
Yeah. So we've talked about content in terms of its transformation over the past 5-10 years. We just touched on a huge topic that is AI. So I guess my last question for you is, what do you anticipate content being in the future? Like, what are your predictions pertaining to content moving forward? Do you think we're staying on the same path that we're currently on now? Do you think there will be some absolutely transformative shift with content?
So
what are your general thoughts?
I think one part of it is that sort of the pressure cooker that I think everybody's in, of, the need to produce more. AI is helping everybody, everyone now has a knob they can turn to 11 to produce content. So that's part of the pressure that everybody's under. In addition, I think generative AI being used for filtering and search and sort of answer engines that do the searching and ingestion for potential audiences and serve up a single consolidated answer. I think that's the flip side of that pressure cooker that's making it very difficult, because I think that's where the just turning the knob up and producing more doesn't necessarily help if there's an engine out there whose only job is filtering that noise out. I think that consolidation we talked about of how, marketing and, support and technical information and thought leadership that, isn't necessarily product focused, but helps build a base of trust. All of those things help with that filter problem of, AI being a gateway between customers and, and the messages that you're trying to get out there. Where it gets tricky, I think, is measuring is a lot harder. If sales are fine, traffic has gone down by 50%. What does that mean today? Does that mean the website was never doing anything? Does that mean, oh, the website is getting fewer human visitors, but it's doing great at getting our message in front of people in, AI?
Yeah.
What does it mean? I don't think those are unanswerable questions, but like the practice of measuring and planning and executing on a campaign is changing, as I think we have to get more explicit about outcomes we're trying to generate and how we know whether we're on the right track for those things, rather than relying on the baked in easy metrics that I think we've all kind of been able to enjoy when every property we published was sort of a destination that we could own and measure directly.
Yeah.
I think having to tackle a more complicated picture of measuring outcomes and success is one of the biggest changes, I think, because
Absolutely.
a lot of teams, either they're not used to that, or organizations may not have good alignment with, if we really start figuring out what tasks produce the outcomes that are going to pay off, which team is incentivized to it, or are we still just telling everybody try to generate engagement, when we now realize, oh, well, for this particular outcome we're trying to serve, engagement's not really connected to it directly. We need other stuff.
Yeah.
Planning out that stuff is very, very important, and I think it's only going to become more so.
I agree. It's something that everyone should keep in mind moving forward, because it's almost like measuring. You're gonna have to rethink how you measure success.
Yeah. And
So.
I think the joke I've always used is, the easiest way to generate engagement is to sink $20 million into producing a follow-up one-off episode set in the Sopranos universe. Hire all the original cast that you can get, do it, launch it, put it on your homepage, and you will get traffic. You will get engagement. Does it have anything to do with your business?
Probably
Does it
not.
actually generate it?
No.
And,
Could be entertaining though.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I think when you put it in absurd terms like that, everybody gets, oh, well, of course, that's not what we're trying to do. We're not, HBO. But I think when it gets down into the nitty gritty of planning out a, campaign, what are we going to prioritize? What are we going to invest in building or, publishing? I think it's easy to lose sight of the principle, because it's not quite so silly as, putting it in those terms.
Yeah.
But like, are we actually doing the stuff that moves the needle on what matters for what we're trying to get at? Or are we just, making sure the graph looks good?
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else additionally you'd like to share, Jeff?
Well, there is one other piece that I think is going to be, I think a lot of organizations are feeling the pressure today, and it's going to get worse over time.
Okay.
The interplay between content and visual design and presentation is very, very contentious today. A lot of organizations solve it by just sort of baking them in with each other. And, the classic, we're making PDFs. It's like, there's not really a way to pull the stuff out of that PDF and reuse it. It's baked. It is what it is. And even a lot of organizations, their digital web publishing presence works that way. They may have structured storage for their content and a design system to present it, but the way those two pieces work together is still very, very tightly coupled. Like, if an organization, if their design team were to say, hey, we're rolling out our new brand refresh, and 6 of the components we used on the website before, we're retiring those and we're replacing them with some other stuff. A lot of organizations are in a place where adapting to that new visual look and feel means rebuilding all of their old content, because even though they're separate in theory, there's lots of assumptions baked in about how they will work together. And even, what is a campaign page? Well, it's a hero that looks like this, and it's a 2-up that goes here, and then there's a scrolling thing of here. We're very used to talking about those things in visual terms, and then talking about certain things in pure message and content terms. I think there's a real need to address like the middle layer of how those things work with each other, rather than just expecting that somebody will update the other half.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I feel like people don't think about it that way. And I'm happy you brought it up because, when you boil it down, like imagine a children's book. If the text did not match the pictures, I would be super confused and, absolutely shut it and put it down.
Yep.
So, yeah. No, that's awesome, man. All right. Well, Jeff, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate the great insights. Thank you to those tuning in and listening. We hope you found this conversation just as insightful as I have. We hope we gave you some ideas on improving content, how to collaborate across your teams, and how to prepare for the future in the way that Jeff and I see it. If you'd like to learn more about AmericanEagle.com and Contentful, please feel free to visit our websites for additional resources. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Lessons for Tomorrow podcast. Find out more about AmericanEagle.com services and today's topic in the description below. Like, comment, subscribe, give us 5 stars, and share this episode with others. This podcast is brought to you by AmericanEagle.com Studios, and we'll catch you in the next lesson.